Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from Qur'anite.com. Today is Thursday the 7th of March 2019, and today I'd like to address the kill the unbeliever meme, which is out there being sort of put about by, well, several camps actually. One would be the so-called far right in their attacks against brand Islam. The second would be certain types of Christians in their attacks against brand Islam. And the third would be brand Islam in its attacks against, well, pretty much everyone else. So if you don't know my work, I analyze the Qur'an on the basis of its contents. I don't assume brand Islam, Sunniism or Shiism. I don't assume their conclusions. I don't assume their religions and then try to sort of, screw those values to the Quran and claim, as they do, and claim it as their that they have monopoly rights over this book, which actually is anathema to what they teach. But I actually look at the Quran on the basis of its own contents. Now, I've got a few notes here that I'd like to go through. I'm not going to go through specific verses because it depends on who's arguing the case. The first point I'd like to make is that both all parties, the far right so-called, which are really, I suppose, conservatives, or would have been called conservatives in the 1950s, and the more hysterical elements of Christianity, who dislike Islam for another set of reasons, and the Islamicists themselves, they assume a value for the word kafirun, which is translated famously by the traditionalist himself as infidel or unbeliever and so on. I'm going to link at the end of this video to another video which I've just made, which will explain why that the Quran itself cannot consistently bear that value. And actually, if you look at that value of kafirun, it's much closer to the type of religionist that we see in the world in many iterations, including that of brand Islam. So, but that's just going to leave that to one side. The second thing is that I'm not here to apologize for what brand Islam claims. And when I say brand Islam, what I really mean by that is, you see, Islam is in the classical sense is a civilization, which primarily Arab and then Persian and then Turkic. It's a civilization. The Quran uses the word Islam, and it cannot possibly mean this civilization, primarily because that civilization didn't exist at the time, but also in the way that it uses it. I mean, Islam is simply it's an abstract noun. It just means submission. Now, to God. Now, obviously, what the traditionalist has done is saying, yes, this is Islam, and everybody, we know what Islam is, and blah blah blah. There's no way you can consistently apply the traditionalists' definition of Islam to the way the Quran uses the book. They uses the word. They're completely different values. However, the fact is that the Quran is also a history. It refers to itself as that, dhikr. It's a remembrance. It's a narration of things which happened before. It narrates the time of Ibrahim, the time of Musa, the time of Ad, the time of Thamud, the time of Lut, the time of Nuh. It's a history. It's an iteration. It's a presentation of histories. Likewise, it is a presentation of, as it were, real-time history, the time of Muhammad, and it's explaining what was happening at that time. And certainly, war was a feature of that time. There's no getting away from that. Also, war is a part of life. There's also no getting away from that. And certainly the Quran contains instructions at that time of whom to fight and how to fight them. However, you see, what the Christian rather doesn't like is it wants to sort of defang the tiger, as it were, And because what's happened to Christianity, and again, I'm not defending brand Islam here, I'm just trying to give you a bit of context. Because what's happened to Christianity is now, it's really a sub-cult of the main cult. The main cult is, I suppose, what we call democracy, which is really a deceptive form of tyranny. It's tyranny where you appear to have a choice. It's the kind of choice like a 5-year-old child has the choice to clear up their bedroom. Everybody understands the room will be tidied up. So this is democracy. There's an agenda, and it's rolled through with everybody sort of appearing to have a choice, but not really. However, the teeth of the system remain, and I would say that that's NATO. NATO really picked up where Christendom left off. NATO is the jihad aspect of democracy, and democracy is Christianity without Christianity. It's a kind of gushy feeling of a bland, undefined, nondescript sympathy for anybody the media can point your attention at. Whoever, depending on which country needs to be bombed back into the Stone Age. So, like Christendom, it's just, but the iconography is a bit different, but fundamentally it's the same sort of thing. So what Christians often are doing is they're comparing their current day religion, which is just a personal conceit. It's a bunch of people getting together, singing Kumbaya, hugging each other, and deciding to believe something. And because they don't go out killing people, well, actually they do, but they do it under different aegis. They think that now everybody else has got to be exactly the same as them. And maybe they're right. Perhaps everybody else should be exactly the same as them. It's just all that's happened is a separation now in the Christian world between church and state. It's the state that goes out and bombs everybody using the Christians' in inverted commas tax money. So, they are separated from it, and they feel that everybody else should be separated from it too. And who knows? Perhaps they're right. I don't know. But they have, they've rather assumed their own conclusions and how they want things to be, and they want to now apply this to the Muslim. The traditionalist Muslim, is living. He's in a bit of a time lag. You see, he's where the Christian was a couple of hundred years ago, where there is no separation of church and state. The believer goes out himself and murders people on his own account, whereas the Christian, I'm not being nasty about Christians, but it's a fact, he outsources that to professionals. People still die. It doesn't make any difference. But the Christian is rather, intimidated and irritated by somebody who still has not, divided the church and state in the way that he has, and rather feels that everybody else should do the same sort of thing. So that's that point. The Qur'an not only has, Muhammad and the believers, al-mu'minun, fighting against the sort of, as it were, the foe of the day, but it also relates stories of the children of Israel, for example, who are ordered, to go in and to take the land, and they refuse to do it, and so on. I haven't heard any Christians complaining about that. We also have the story in the Qur'an of Tālūt, who is generally connected with the person of Saul, going out, although actually has much more in common with what's it called, Gideon, but it's a separate issue. Going out, as it were, to fight the Philistines. And David kills Goliath. I haven't heard any Christians complaining about the Qur'an because it contains killing there. You see, but that's a history, that's a story, that's something that happened in the previous times. Well, to us, the story of Muhammad and the people of that time, this is something now for us, it's a history. And that brings us to the next point, which is part of the problem is that both the Islamicist and the, as it were, anti-Islamicist, they generalize these quote-unquote Muhammadan historical instances in a way that they don't generalize, let's say, David fighting Goliath. So it's just a matter of what lessons you take from it. And it's just a matter of fact that the Christians' own scriptures, that they lay claim to, what's called the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, is a catalogue of murder and killing. But they now take from that, generally speaking, if you hear Christians, pronouncing from the pulpit, and they're talking about David, for example, going out to kill his son Absalom, Absalom, and they'll take spiritual lessons from that. They don't say that the Christians in Key West Methodist Church have now got to go out and find anybody called Absalom and chop his head off. That's not what they're saying. They're drawing different conclusions, and one could draw a whole load of different conclusions from the things that are in the Qur'an. But what we find is that, and this is interesting in life, if you look at, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans, or you look at the left and the right, you look at the liberals and the far right, it's not what they disagree about that's so interesting. It's what they agree about. It's the things that they assume together are accepted. That's a bit of a separate issue, but what we find is that the Christians and the far right and brand Islam, they all tend to agree with each other that this is what the Qur'an means. It means you've got to go out and start fighting people and killing people. Well, that's an interesting conclusion, given the fact that that's not what everyone's claiming from the Hebrew scriptures. I mean, you will find rabid Jews who think that that's the case. Maybe you'll find some sort of Christian identity people who think that that's the case, but in the vast majority of cases nobody's claiming that, and there are other scriptures where this is also not claimed, and I'll get into that in a moment as well. So the problem fundamentally, I'm just referring to my notes here, is unpicking the general principles from the specific instances, and this is a perennial problem in any religion, and brand Islam is sort of, I suppose, in fact I would agree, it is particularly problematic in that way, but it's not something that other religions haven't managed to unpick and become, as it were, quote unquote civilized, or at least to achieve their division between church and state, so that rather than getting your hands dirty yourself and going out with a dagger and sticking it into somebody, you can pay somebody to drop a smart bomb on them from 10 miles up in the air, which is so much nicer. So that's that bit. I would say war is a part of life, and it seems a little irritating to me personally to watch the Christians who have such a bloody history of over 1700 years really of murdering people fairly indiscriminately. Now at the beginning of the 21st century, to turn around and accuse anybody or say to anybody that they shouldn't be killing anybody seems to me a little bit rich. But however, now that Christianity has become a milksop religion, and that's not an insult, it is what it is. And compare it to Charlemagne of the 8th century, going out and basically forcing people at the point of a sword to embrace Christianity. Obviously, it looks very different now. So really, everyone's agreeing that brand Islam is behind the times, as it were. And I agree, perhaps it is behind the times, but it's a different question as to whether that's what the Qur'an actually says, but everybody agrees that's what it says, and that's interesting to me, the sort of overlap between these three apparently divergent camps. Christians, as it were, and it's not all Christians, of course, the far right, and again, it's not all of the far right, and brand Islam, and again, it's not all brand Islam, but typically and generically agreeing that the Qur'an is telling people that they specifically should now, believers now, on the basis of what happened, 1,400 years ago, should be going out killing, unbelievers, in inverted commas. Again, the Christian scriptures, the Old Testament, as they call it, and our Bible, as the Jews call it, is full of warfare. It's genocidal. I mean, read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Read the Torah, as it's the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The children of Israel are instructed specifically to go out and murder everybody in the land. Now, maybe they had some mitigating circumstances, I don't know. Are there Jews out there in the world today who think that imperative holds true for today? Sure there are. Do most Jews wake up in the morning feeling they've got to go out and kill everybody? No, I don't think that's the case. So what I'm trying to say is it's not that the Qur'an itself is this book which in some way is full of fighting and therefore it's an evil book. It depends on how you read it to some extent. I mean, at least to some extent, I think we should accept that. So I would say that basically what's sauce for the goose to some extent should be sauce for the gander. Now there's one other point I wanted to get to before I get to my final point, which is if you look at most of these sort of war and killing verses, if you read a couple of verses either side, you will generally find that it says something like, and if they stop, you stop. And that, if it doesn't, of course you can claim verses out of context and say that, it says, kill the unbelievers. Well, yeah, sure, it does say that. But the Bible, the Old Testament, says there is no God. That's Psalms 14:1, I believe. It does say that. Now, if you're going to agree that that's what it means, okay, fine. But I think you'd find most Jews and most Christians a little bit more, subtle than that, a bit more nuanced. They realise that what 14:1 says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So, it's looking at a broader context. And I would say, well, if you want that kind of attitude toward the Bible, then perhaps you should extend the same sort of thing to the Qur'an and just claiming, it says this one verse and that's what it means. And again, I freely admit that there is this overlap where stunningly, the far right, the certain type of Christian and the traditionalist, Islamicist, wild-eyed, bearded, dagger-wielding guy, they all agree that's what it means. So when you start looking at where supposedly opposing forces, where they all agree, you're going to find quite a lot of interesting things to look at. Now, I'm going to close with the last point, which is to do with other traditions. Now, let's take, for example, Hinduism. And if you look at Hinduism, one of its core scriptures, it's a compilation of various stories, an epic, the Mahabharata, which is colossal. I have a copy, and it's you could use it as a doorstop, and it's not the whole thing. I think it's about a fifth of the total. But I read the introduction to this. It was very interesting. This book, which most Hindus won't have read all of, in fact, the vast majority of Hindus won't have read all of, but it still is it's a sort of canonical part of Hinduism. In this book, 1.6 billion people are genocided in this book. All right. Now, admittedly, most Hindus don't read this book, but from the Mahabharata, you get the Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavad Gita is read by Hindus. It's a core part of Vedantic Hinduism, and it's a very popular part of the religion. And I've not heard anybody. I'm sure you could find somebody, but you don't typically hear people inveighing against the Bhagavad Gita because it's a book of war. Well, then you should read the Bhagavad Gita, which I have several times. It is entirely focused around a war scenario, with the Lord Krishna advising Arjuna, who is one of the principal actors in the story, to fight his own kin. Now, I freely admit I'm not inveighing against the Bhagavad Gita. I think everybody should read it. It's a very interesting read. However, there's no question that the Bhagavad Gita is dealing with some very thorny, difficult moral issues. However, Krishna's advice to Arjuna is to fight his own kin. Now, no one would say, I don't think, that the Bhagavad Gita is principally a work which is concerned with and promoting the concept of war. And also, it's a point of fact that the Bhagavad Gita was popularized by the pacifist Gandhi, who read it as his principal scripture. So, in conclusion, I think what we find in scripture has got an awful lot to do with who we are. It is possible to read the Bhagavad Gita and to take all kinds of, civilizing and, calming and philosophical points from it. Why is it that the Christians and the brand Islam and the far right all agree that the Qur'an is only talking about war and death, and that this is what it's about? I would say that that's a very immature assessment, and in any case, in the vast majority of cases, if you look at the actual context and read a little broader than these snippets, which all three camps tend to sort of fire about as memes in order to advance their agendas, then you find that the underlying principle is often, even though war is accepted as a part of life, as it is in the Old Testament, and it certainly is in the Bhagavad Gita, that the principle is, when they stop, you should stop. And that's my position on it, and I hope that's of interest. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Qur'an free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Qur'anite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Qur'an alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short, eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.